Today is Friday, 30th August, the last Friday in August 2024. Friday, August 2024 has proved a fateful month for Ukraine. It was the month where Ukraine launched its Kursk offensive, and it's the month in which Ukraine, by my estimates, has probably experienced the heaviest losses at any point during the conflict, and where, of course, Ukraine has lost the most ground over the course of the conflict, at any rate since the summer of 2022. So this has been a very important month. It's probably the decisive month, the month where one can say that the scales have tipped decisively against Ukraine. And as we will see, there are articles now starting to appear, even in the British media, which are starting to effectively concede as much. So what has happened over the last 24 hours? Well, probably the news that's attracted the most attention is the news that Ukraine lost an F-16 on the first day that F-16s were put into operation, which was on Monday, the 26th of August. Now, this was, of course, the night and the day of Russia's missile strike. Big missile strike, the biggest missile strike, in my opinion, launched by Russia over the course of the entire conflict since the special military operation began. And according to some reports, Ukraine has perhaps 2 operational F-16s and amongst 6 that have been delivered. And, well, for a couple of days afterwards, we got reports that a pilot who had been trained to fly F-16s had died, and there were a few hushed whispers that perhaps an F-16 had also been lost. And yesterday, the Wall Street Journal in the United States finally confirmed that that was the case. How exactly it was lost is something that, of course, the Ukrainians have not properly confirmed. In fact, we're getting lots of contradictory stories. The Russian account, which is at least consistent, is that the F-16 was destroyed on the ground, that certain pictures which appeared in Ukrainian social media showing the widow of a Ukrainian pilot being shown F-16s in hangar buildings enabled the Russians to identify the location of the F-16s in question, which was in an airfield near the Ukrainian town, the western Ukrainian town of Ivano-Frankovsk. A missile strike did in fact take place on Ivano-Frankovsk as part of the gigantic Russian missile strike of the 26th of August. There's been much speculation that one or more of these missiles targeted the hangar buildings where the F-16 was located. The F-16 was destroyed together with it, presumably with its pilot. Well, that's a story. It's not a story, by the way, that comes from the Russian Defense Ministry. The Russian Defense Ministry today has published its account of the events of the last week, which I'll come to later in this program. It refers to various Ukrainian aircraft which have been destroyed, as it often does. But I noticed that the F-16 is not amongst them. So the Russian Defense Ministry is not claiming that the Ukrainian F-16 was destroyed as a result of Russian military action. Just saying. But anyway, there have been other reports. One report says that it was all down to pilot error. These are reports that come from Ukraine, that the F-16 was sent into the skies to try to shoot down Russian subsonic and other cruise missiles and uranium-2 drones. There was a report in Forbes by our old friend David Axe, claiming that these nimble and effective fighter jets were proving very successful in shooting down these Russian missiles. I mentioned rather sourly in one of my more recent videos that this did not seem to be consistent with the results on the ground, the actual effect of the missile strikes, but never mind. But anyway, that was the report that we had, and then supposedly, according to one Ukrainian report, the F-16, the pilot of the F-16 made some sort of pilot error whilst he was trying to shoot down these Russian missiles, and the result was that the F-16 crashed to earth and he was killed. Might have been the case, I'm not able to say. This morning, Julian Repke, the German correspondent of Bild Zeitung, as I said, a strong but by no means uncritical supporter of Ukraine. Anyway, he has floated a different story, which has, I see, been picked up by many other sources, that the F-16 was shot down in error by the Ukrainians, that a Ukrainian Patriot missile was launched at an aircraft target. The aircraft target was the Ukrainian F-16, and that the F-16 was shot down as a result of friendly fire. Some people are expressing incredulity about this. They're saying that it's incredible that an F-16, an American F-16, an American-built F-16 could have been shot down by an American-built Patriot air defense missile, given that both the F-16 and the Patriot missile were supplied by NATO to Ukraine, and that if that did indeed happen, it would suggest that there was a major problem with the identification friend and foe technology used either by the F-16 or the Patriot missile system, or perhaps by both. Of course, that sort of thing does happen, so it might have been the reason. But anyway, whatever the reason was, an F-16 has been lost on the first day that it went into operation, and the pilot has been killed. And given the relentless way in which the effectiveness of the F-16s has been inflated, that probably will cause some dismay in Ukraine, though I think one shouldn't perhaps make altogether too much of this incident. Most likely the F-16s will be flying in a few weeks' time. Whatever teething problems caused the loss of this one, if it was the result of friendly fire or an accident, will be sorted out. The Russians will, of course, hunt them, and over time, more and more of them will start to get shot down, and that is the point where we will perhaps be in a better position to judge their usefulness. Anyway, there we go. That was the first event. Now, the other event that's taking place today is that, according to reports in the United States, the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Rustem Umerov, is today meeting with the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. Umerov is apparently bringing with him a list of targets in Russia which Ukraine wants to attack with American and Western supplied long-range missiles, Storm Shadows, Scalps, Attackams, perhaps one day Taurus missiles as well, from Germany. Anyway, the reports are circulating that is what this discussion is going to center on. Probably that discussion will happen sometime after this video is made. The pressure in the West to authorize the use of these missiles for deep strikes inside Russia this time disregarding actual Russian red lines, appears to be growing, though as of this morning there has been some pushback. Hungary predictably has announced its adamant opposition to this idea, and so incidentally has Italy. Well, we will see what happens. We will see whether the United States, which of course is the decisive player in this, what it will decide or choose to do. But that's, of course, big news with great consequences in terms of the relationship between the United States and Russia, and about concerning also the future security of the world and of the West generally. But it is not going to change the situation in Ukraine. And well, today, Friday, we started to see a groundswell of criticism in the West and in Ukraine itself about the way in which President Zelensky and his government have been conducting the war over the last few weeks. And though in the West, at least, criticism of the Kursk offensive continues to be muted, when one reads some of the criticism, it becomes increasingly clear that it is the Kursk offensive that is now becoming the center of growing doubts. Now, the article which perhaps encapsulates this criticism best is an article that has appeared in the Financial Times. And it's a very unusual article in terms of the Financial Times, because it not only criticizes Zelensky directly and in the strongest way, but it calls into question Ukraine's entire strategy, and it provides a remarkably accurate, factual account of the state of the war. Something which I don't think I've ever seen to quite this degree in any article that has appeared, certainly in the British media. In the American media, they tend to be more honest about the reality of things. Now, I ought to say that, of course, it is in the Financial Times, in other words, the British media. It's not telling us the whole truth. It's not making direct criticisms of the Kursk offensive, but it is starting to confirm that there are growing concerns and criticisms of the way Zelensky is conducting the war in Ukraine. And the article, which is by Christopher Miller, is of course behind a paywall, so I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but its title is Volodymyr Zelensky faces backlash over Russia's breach of the eastern defenses. Strategically important Pokrovsk resistance has been weakened by demands of Kursk incursion, critics say. And we then read that President Zelensky has come under a barrage of criticism from soldiers, lawmakers, and military analysts over the rapid advances made by the Russian army in eastern Ukraine since Kiev launched its bold incursion into Russia's Kursk region. Many Ukrainians celebrated their army's invasion of Kursk on August 6th, hoping the gamble would force Moscow to divert resources to the new front and swing the momentum of the war in Ukraine's favor. However, a breach in the front line in the strategically important Donetsk region this week has triggered a backlash against the leadership in Kiev, with critics arguing Ukraine's positions were weakened by the redeployment of thousands of battle-hardened Ukrainian troops to the Kursk operation. Russian forces are closing in on the strategically important city of Pokrovsk, taking several towns this week and forcing undermanned Ukrainian units to retreat from prepared defense positions. And the article then admits that Novogrodivka has fallen, that it is under Russian control. We have reports from various soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, that the defenses around Pokrovsk are in a poor condition. We have Zhenya, a Ukrainian soldier in the 93rd Mechanized Brigade who fought in the grueling 10-month battle of Bakhmut last year, describing a fast deteriorating situation in Pokrovsk. In a candid assessment on X, he criticized the military's command structure, citing systemic failures and inadequate responses to evolving battlefield conditions. Honestly, I have never seen anything like this. Everything is falling apart so quickly. Pokrovsk will fall much faster than Bakhmut did. And we also have quotes from Mariana Bezuglaya, who has visited the area. They're the same quotes, by the way, that I discussed in my program. Yesterday, we had the attempts, the article refers to the attempts by General Syrski to paper over the cracks, that he's apparently commenting about the fact that he's just visited the Pokrovsk area and he's working to strengthen the defense of our troops in the most difficult areas of the front to provide the brigades with a sufficient amount of ammunition and other material and technical means. I have to say that reads to me like a very downbeat statement from the Supreme Commander. He's not saying that he's going to bring the situation under control. It's saying that he's working to strengthen the defense, and appears to be admitting that there are equipment shortages and ammunition shortages. But anyway, that's for another day. Then we have quotes from somebody called Roman Pogorili, who works for the mapping program which I refer to as DS, which of course has a connection with the Ukrainian military. He says this is complete chaos, and he confirms the fall of Novogrodivka. And we then have comments from Rob Lee, Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute, who admits that Russian gains are due to a shortage of experienced Ukrainian infantry and the diversion of resources to the Kursk offensive. Ukraine committed reserves to Kursk, leaving fewer options to plug gaps elsewhere. Some of the more experienced brigades have been replaced by newer, less experienced units, Lee said. And we then have the quotes, which we've had before, about how soldiers who are fighting in the Pokrovsk area and recently mobilized soldiers are really not up to the taking on the veteran and highly trained and well-equipped Russian infantry. And then we're told that soldiers in artillery units near Pokrovsk highlight again deficit in shells and a severe mismatch in firepower compared to Russian forces. Our shells are running out. We just don't have enough, an artillery commander said. He's noting that his units had one shell for every 6 to 8 fired by the Russians, and that many resources had been redirected north to Kursk. And we're told that the Russians retain a significant tactical advantage, bolstered by superior aviation and drone capabilities. And there's a quote from Stanislav Asayev, who is a Ukrainian journalist and soldier, and he's warning of the possible destruction of the entire southern group of forces in the region, not just Pokrovsk. And he cites this is a quote from him, a complex of internal reasons, from the planting of flowers instead of fortifications. I wonder whether that is, by the way, a slightly acid reference, an evasive reference to the many funerals that have happened of Ukrainian soldiers. But I don't want to push that, because understanding irony in another country and in another language is a challenging thing. Anyway, complex of internal reasons, from the planting of flowers instead of fortifications, to the lack of understanding on the part of the High Command of the problems evident to every soldier in the trenches. What can be done for Pokrovsk? He asks rhetorically, and then he answers his own question. Unfortunately, the only option is to evacuate as many people as possible. I think the town will soon cease to exist. And then we're told that the Ukrainian leadership still has options, and such as deploying new brigades or repositioning forces from other areas, which of course creates a whole set of new problems. But we're warned that if Pokrovsk falls, the Russians can push on towards Dnipro and indeed to the Dnieper River, though it is not mentioned. And that's what the article says. It's really incredibly factual. If you've been reading the British media, as I have been reading over the last 2.5 years, in some ways, this article is revelatory. It's finally telling British readers not just the situation as it really is, but is also communicating to them for the first time the extent of the doubts that many Ukrainians have about the competence and capability of their own leaders. Anyway, there it is. That's in the British media today. What is the situation on the battlefronts? Well, let's first of all start with the situation in the Pokrovsk area, since that's the situation that is being talked about here in this article in the Financial Times. And, well, the reports today speak of continued Russian advances in Selidovo. By some accounts, something like 40% of this town is now under Russian control. And also we've had confirmation now from Ukrainian sources that the Russians are in complete control of Novogrodivka, including the 2 slag heaps in the north and all the area to the northern tip of Novogrodivka, and also of Novogrodivka, the whole of Novogrodivka, the western part of Novogrodivka, and importantly and very interestingly, of the coal mine and slag heap that lies to the west of Novogrodivka, where many people believed, perhaps naively, that the Ukrainian forces, having been pushed out of Novogrodivka, would establish new defense lines and make their next stand. It looks like this entire territory of Novogrodivka has now fallen rapidly under Russian control. Now, yesterday I mentioned that there were reports that the Russians have entered Mirnograd and that fighting is taking place inside Mirnograd. Today, I've heard no further reports about this, but interestingly, no denials either. No denials that the Russian troops are inside Mirnograd. And the Ukrainians have released some pictures of drone attacks on Russian soldiers in Grodivka. And I interpret these pictures as confirmation that the Russians are indeed in control of the whole of Grodivka. So all the places that we've been hearing being fought over the last couple of days, Novogrodivka, Grodivka, perhaps Mirnograd, the reports that we were getting from there about Russian control are essentially confirmed. I suspect the Russians control Mikhailovka, the northern Mykolaievka, as well as Kruty Yar and Krasny Yar, as well as Grodivka itself. About that, we've not yet received confirmation, but I'm reasonably confident that that is true. And as I said, we have lots of reports, including from Ukrainian mapping projects, which appear to show the Russians now deep inside Selidovo, with the two coal mines on the eastern end of Selidovo, the one in Mikhailovka and the other one with the gigantic slag heap on the eastern outskirts of Selidovo, securely under Russian control. Now, a Russian telegram channel, I think it was in Slava, is talking about the Russians now storming Selidovo from three directions, presumably from the north, the east, and the south. And if you look at the position of Russian forces, you can see how that might be possible. I don't know how long the Battle of Selidovo will last, but it seems as if the Russians are cutting through it very fast, just as they cut through Novogrodivka, very fast. But perhaps even more consequential than what has happened or is happening in Selidovo itself is what has happened a little to the west and east, because there are now reports, in fact not just reports, they appear to be confirmed, that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from the village of Karlovka, which was along the main road, the MO4 road, which goes ultimately to Donetsk city, that the Ukrainians have pulled out of Karlovka. The Ukrainians had made a stand in Karlovka after the villages of Pervomaysky and Nitailovo, close to to Avdiivka, were captured by the Russians. But now the Ukrainians have been forced to abandon Karlovka. There is photographic and film evidence which apparently confirms this. And I'm hearing reports that the neighboring village of Galitsinivka, which was the main supply base of the Ukrainian soldiers who had located themselves in Karlovka, that has also passed fully under Russian control. And there are even some reports that the Russians in Memrik, which they captured a couple of days ago, and in Galitsinivka are now preparing to push westwards, west and south, towards the town of Ukrainsk. One wonders what sort of defenses the Ukrainians have in Ukrainsk, just saying. But it could be that Ukrainsk itself will fall fairly soon. Now, I've already discussed the importance of Karlovka and the fall of Karlovka, because of course what this means, especially if the Russians capture Galitsinivka and Ukrainsk, is that the Russians now control the entire MO4 highway from Donetsk city, this entire big highway, all the way from Donetsk city through Pesky, the village of Pesky, which they captured in August 2022, through Pervomaysky, Nitailovo, Karlovka, Memrik, Mikhailovka, Marinivka, all the way right up to the area immediately close, adjacent to Pokrovsk itself. And of course, with the Russians in control of both Novogrodivka, which they already control, and Selidovo, which presumably they will also control within the next few days, this entire highway is clear. And apparently we're talking about some 20 plus kilometers of highway until you reach Selidovo. Probably the highway, the distance is about perhaps another 15 kilometers, 10, 15 kilometers to Pokrovsk itself. But the point is that this is a big, straight highway, most probably a Soviet-built highway, not, of course, a German Autobahn or a French autoroute, but nonetheless a relatively wide main road. I gather that the Ukrainians were able to keep the condition of their roads in relatively good shape before the war began. I remember my late and very lamented friend, Gonzalo Lira, back in 2022, describing the roads in Ukraine as butter smooth. So clearly they were well looked after up to that time. Obviously, since the fighting in 2022, the condition, the road surface of this road will have deteriorated, but obviously it will still be in a good enough condition for large convoys of military trucks with supplies of food, ammunition, fuel, reinforcements, armour, and all of the rest to trundle northwards from the main logistical hub of the Russian army in Donbass, which is of course Donetsk city, all the way up to Pokrovsk. And when the Russians launch their eventual attack on the main part of Pokrovsk, which they probably will do at some point in the next week or so, then of course, most probably, they will have that supply line working for them. There are probably rail links, by the way, connecting Donetsk with Pokrovsk as well. There definitely are. And probably they're in the same area. But I'm going to make a quick guess that those railway lines will take a little longer to bring back into an operational condition. Probably the Russians would not want to use electric locomotives, though unlike the Ukrainians, they have no shortage of diesel locomotives that they could bring to haul the troop trains and ammunition and equipment trains. But it will probably take them some time to sort out the railways. In the meantime, the road is there, already available for use. Obviously, you cannot move as much equipment and supplies along a road as you can through the railways, but I suspect that for the Russians' purposes around Pokrovsk, this big, perhaps multi-lane highway is more than good enough. Incidentally, I ought to say that I have been surprised that the Russians have been able to move so far, so fast in this western area, in part because I have wondered how the Russians have been able to maintain their logistic supplies, how they've been able to keep supplies going for the frontline troops, given that since the Russians captured Ocheretino and have been advancing westwards, they've had to rely on relatively small, light country roads very different from this highway that I'm talking about. And of course, these are rather complex. It's a rather complicated, winding road system. One might have expected that the Russians would have more difficulty maintaining their supplies. But nonetheless, they were able to do it, and they were able to advance this far. And now they have the road, the big road, that they can use, and it will have probably a drastic, even revolutionary effect on their supply situation. The Russians have never been able to utilize a main road like this at any point up to now in the Battle of Donbass. One of the big advantages that the Ukrainians have had is that all of the main roads leading to the various positions on the contact lines, all the main roads and all the big railway lines have been controlled by the Ukrainians. Now the Russians have one of these important roads. And, well, the Ukrainians no doubt will make an effort to try to hold Pokrovsk, but with all the surrounding towns and villages falling under Russian control, most probably over the next couple of days, we're going to see a sustained attempt by the Russians to clear up the villages to the east of Mirnograd, places like Vozvizhenka, Yelizavetka, Novoekonomichka, all of these places. We're probably going to see the Russians act to clear these villages, and again, with the supply situation now basically resolved, it ought to be a relatively straightforward task to do that. Well, from that point onwards, the Russians will be able to attack Mirnograd, at least from both the east and the south, perhaps even from the north, and with the Russians holding Novogrodivka and Selidovo, they can also begin a major offensive towards Pokrovsk from the south. And I do, at this stage of the war, wonder in what condition the Ukrainians are, how the Ukrainians are going to be able to defend Pokrovsk. I doubt that they will be able to defend it for even a fraction of the time that it took the Russians to capture Bakhmut just over a year ago. So there we go, a disastrous situation for the Ukrainians, one which the Financial Times is correct in reporting in that way. And, well, I've already discussed, and many others have done so, Tatarigami in Euromaidan, Mariana Bezuglaya, the Ukrainian MP. What a disaster, what a catastrophe for the Ukrainians it would be if Pokrovsk were to be captured by the Russians. And frankly, I think that there is nothing now, realistically, that can prevent that event from happening. Even if, at this point, Zelensky were to do that which the reports or rumors yesterday were saying that he refuses to do, which is to pull the troops out of Kursk, I don't think by now that would be enough to turn the situation, to change the situation in the Pokrovsk area. It's worth bearing in mind that the Ukrainians were already retreating in this area some time before the Kursk operation was launched. So even when those better trained forces were located in this area to the west of Ocheretino, the Ukrainians were unable to any great degree to hold the Russians back. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation in the Pokrovsk area. Before I leave, I want to just make one further quick observation about one of the explanations, in my opinion, for the speed of the Russian advance. There's been an awful lot said about the state of the Ukrainian forces around Pokrovsk, the fact that these are second-line, recently mobilized units, many of them unwilling to fight or unable to fight with the same determination and courage and skill that the more experienced Ukrainian soldiers who were called up in 2022 were prepared to do. And I think that is clearly true. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about the huge discrepancy in firepower between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And that, of course, is also true. I think one of the major factors explaining the speed of the Russian advance is the fact that in the Pokrovsk area, it is the regular Russian army, not this strange medley of forces, the Donbass militia, some of whose units, the Vostok, Sparta and Somalia brigades, admittedly were very tough fighters. The Chechen forces, the Wagner forces, the airborne forces, the Marines. Instead of those forces, what we see for the first time conducting a major offensive in central Ukraine on the main Ukrainian battlefronts is the Russian regular army drawing on its regular units. The spearhead forces, by the way, as one might expect, are the motorized rifle brigades. These are relatively light infantry moving fast westwards along the roads on their wheeled armoured personnel carriers, the BTRs. Behind them are the tank forces with the mechanized regiments and their tracked vehicles. They are there. They're moving just behind the motorized spearhead. But anyway, it is the Russian regular army. Now, the point here is that the fact that we're talking about the Russian regular army doesn't mean necessarily that these are better fighters than some of the other fighters who have been fighting in the war before. But it does mean that command and control will be simpler. It does mean that there is a greater coherence to this Russian force that is pushing westwards. And of course, and this is not to be overlooked, they have General Mordvichev, one of Russia's toughest and most successful and capable battlefield generals commanding them. So I think we can talk lots about the weaknesses and deficiencies on the Ukrainian side, but we should not overlook the capabilities of the Russians. Anyway, that is what I'm going to say about the Pokrovsk area. Now, I'm going to turn to the other place where the fighting, which the Financial Times touches upon, which is the area of the Kursk offensive. And I think now no one seriously questions any longer the point that I have made, that Brian Beletic has made, that Daniel Davis has made, that Jim Webb has made, that all sorts of military people have made, my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on the Duran has made, all of us have been making, though you wouldn't know about it if you took your news exclusively from the Western media, that the Ukrainian Kursk offensive is at a total standstill. In fact, the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians back, and the operation has failed to achieve all of its objectives, even be it the unannounced ones, like the capture of the Kursk nuclear power plant, or the announced ones, the attempt to get the Russians to divert their forces from Donbass. So the Ukrainians are left in the worst possible geographical conditions, an area of forests and streams and hills and little rivers, trying to hold their positions in what is a 15-kilometer deep but very unstable salient against Russian forces that are getting stronger every day. And you can see this in the growing confidence of Russian reports, the Russian military reports from Group of Forces North and from the Russian Defense Ministry. And you can also see this from the growing evidence of Ukrainian losses. I'm going to not discuss Russian military reports this time about the fighting in Kursk in great detail. Group of Forces North have again provided their daily update, which they always do. They speak about the situation in very much the same terms that they always have. Fierce fighting unfolded in the north of Sudzha district. The Ukrainians supposedly carried out attacks northward but were repelled. They've also been repelled in attacks that they've launched against Cherkasskaya, Konopielka, Plechovo, and Borki. An interesting point is that the group of forces north is now talking about the village of Plechovo as if it were under Russian control. Now, this is a village which the Ukrainians undoubtedly did capture. If Plechovo is now under Russian control, that means that the Russians have recaptured it following a counterattack. And however, the key thing is that they also insert this paragraph in the direction of Korenevo. The enemy is regrouping due to heavy losses and has taken no actions. We gradually squeeze the enemy towards the state border. That's the second time in a week that the Russians are saying that. And they're talking about the very heavy losses that the Ukrainians have suffered over the previous 24 hours. They say that in the Sumy Kursk area, this is Group of Forces North, they're saying that the Ukrainians lost 310 men, killed or wounded. The Russian Defense Ministry puts the number at 380 troops killed or wounded. The most interesting thing, however, is that Group of Forces North is barely reporting any important armored vehicle losses by the Ukrainians. The Russian Defense Ministry says that 1 tank and 21 armored fighting vehicles were destroyed, but that is a reduction on what we were seeing before. By the way, the Russian Defense Ministry says that Ukrainian losses in total since this operation in Kursk region began on the 6th of August number 7,800 men killed or wounded, along with 75 tanks, 36 infantry fighting vehicles, and 64 armoured personnel carriers. But the daily count of armoured vehicles that the Russians claim to be destroying is falling, almost certainly indicating that the Ukrainians are running out of them, that the armoured force that was sent into Kursk region has effectively been destroyed. So, a Kursk operation that is going badly wrong. The Russians are regaining ground. I noticed that the Military Summary Channel, which had at one point taken a rather optimistic view of Ukraine's Kursk offensive, I'm sure that they wouldn't disagree with me about that. They too are reporting that the Russians are gradually regaining ground. And it doesn't look as if the Ukrainians are really succeeding in any of their other attempts to break through the Russian border in any other location or place. Political reasons, as I discussed yesterday, the need to save face, Zelensky's need to persuade Biden to authorize his plan for victory when he meets Biden in September, a plan for victory which appears to be based on Ukrainian control of the territory the Ukrainians have captured in Kursk region, prevents the Ukrainians pulling out, or at least prevents Zelensky pulling out the forces from Kursk region. But in the meantime, the battle of the Kursk region is not only going in the Russians' favor, but it is also helping the Russians in another way by pinning down in this remote area of the Russian border some of Ukraine's best troops, and is helping the Russians to conduct relentless attrition against them. And this is the other big reason why the Russians have been advancing so fast in Ukraine over the last couple of weeks, because we are seeing now the accumulated effect of attrition. The two best commentators on this, in my opinion, are Scott of Redacted and Brian Beletic. Well, Daniel Davis, obviously, has also been talking about this extensively. And so, in fairness of the other military people, Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter. But anyway, the most detailed discussions, other than those that we do on this channel, of course, and with myself and Alex Christoforou on the Duran, in my opinion, have been done by Scott of Calibrated and by Brian Beletic. And the overall story is that this attrition is achieving its effects. It's ground the Ukrainians down to the point where they're unable to hold ground, and that's why they're falling back so fast in the Pokrovsk direction, and why they're also losing ground in other places, and we're going to come to those other places shortly as well. And over the last couple of weeks, this level of attrition, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, has achieved a scale that we have never seen at any point in the conflict up to now. It's just a few months ago, roughly at the time of the Avdiivka fighting, that the Russians were reporting that the Ukrainians were losing, killed and wounded, in any one day, around 700 to 800 men. Then, sometime in the late spring, early summer, we saw Ukrainian losses shoot above 1,000 men, every killed or wounded on any particular day. Now it stably exceeds 2,000 men killed or wounded on any particular day. Over the last week, the Russian Defense Ministry claims that the Ukrainians have lost almost 17,000 men killed or wounded over a space of 7 days. Now, obviously, and I make this point again, I am not able to confirm or corroborate these figures. There have been corroborations, there has been information which has come from the Ukrainian side at various times, dribbles of information that suggest that these Russian numbers are roughly right. But put that aside, what the Russian Defense Ministry reports, I think, reliably show, even if you don't accept the exact figures that they're giving, is the direction of travel, that Ukraine's losses are growing continuously all the time, and that since the start of this year, the loss rate, the attrition rate that the Ukrainians have been suffering has been exploding. And obviously, it's likely that many of these men who are dying, perhaps the greater part of them, are recently mobilized soldiers, which, by the way, is a human tragedy which should not be overlooked or underestimated. But inevitably, some of the best soldiers, the best trained soldiers, are dying also, and they're dying in places like Kursk, and they're not being replaced. And this ultimately is why Bezuglaya is traveling around and looking at the trenches near Selidovo and Novogrodivka and finding them empty, because the Ukrainians no longer have the manpower to fill them, because that manpower has been attritioned away. Attrition wars are brutal. They're grinding and ruthless, and, well, they're a horrible thing to watch. But they are also terrifyingly effective when used in the way that the Russians conducted, in the way that the Russians have been conducting them. Americans ought to know this best because, of course, perhaps the most famous war in American history, the American Civil War, was ultimately fought and won in the same way. The same kind of military strategy has been followed by the Russians in this conflict in Ukraine, and we are starting to see, in fact, we are very much in the process now of seeing the effect. And note that as well as the manpower, the equipment is running out. The Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, has been bitterly complaining that Ukraine has not been receiving all of the Patriot missile systems and launchers from the West that the West has promised. And again, I have to say, I think he ought to have been listening on this to Brian Beletic, because Brian Beletic has been explaining in program after program that the West cannot supply ballistic missiles, Patriot missiles to Ukraine in the sort of quantities that the Ukrainians demand and expect, because there is a worldwide shortage of Patriot missile launchers, and that there are problems with the production of Patriot missile launchers and missiles, and that the number of missiles being produced at any one time, in any 1 year, at the moment is barely 500 to 600. And compare that with the 127 cruise missiles, some of them hypersonic, that Zelensky himself admitted that the Russians were able to launch against Ukraine on one single day, which is Monday, the 26th of August. And of course, we've had many, many other days of Russian missile strikes like that. So Ukraine has been ground down. It's been ground down in terms of its manpower, and it's been ground down in terms of its equipment as well, and its ammunition, and its tanks, and its armored vehicles, and all of the rest. And the way that Ukraine has conducted the war, holding on to every position, defending every position for as long as it can, has of course facilitated that. Well, I discussed the situation in Pakrovsk and in Kursk region in some detail. It's perhaps as well to round up the news by talking about what's going on in other battlefronts. It seems that the Russians are continuing to press ahead in the area around Vuhledar, where they've recently captured the village of Konstantinovka. We now have absolute proof that they've not only captured Konstantinovka, but the kitchen garden settlements, the allotments, the area of the allotments that adjoin Konstantinovka. Allotment areas are very, very common in close to villages and urban communities in the former Soviet Union. Anyway, that area has also been captured as well. The Russians apparently continuing to advance in the Vremivka salient area. There's a report about this from TASS, from the TASS news agency today, about how the Russians are pushing northwards from in the Vremivka salient, from the towns of villages of Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, and that they're moving northwards towards Novoselivka, Persha, and other places. This could become an important advance eventually, once Vuhledar falls or is captured by the Russians, if the Russians do intend at some point to mount an advance towards the Dnieper, they can move westwards perhaps from Pokrovsk once it's captured, and they can advance northwards from the area of the Vremivka salient, if that's what they also choose to do. Just say. And in Donetsk, there was news that yesterday that more of the village of Druzhba has been captured, that this has almost been captured, that the Russians have also been advancing closer to those villages west of the, I think it was the M40 highway, I'm not absolutely sure now, to the east of Donetsk, villages like Alexandropil and all of those. And those villages also look like the Russians, they will fall under Russian control fairly soon. And they also seem to be gradually cutting the communications line, the lines of communication to the Ukrainian garrison in the prison. And, well, we've heard nothing further about those cut-off Ukrainian troops further south in New York, in the industrial area of New York, and in Zalizny. We know that there are Ukrainian troops cut off there because one of the Ukrainian brigades, the soldiers of one of the Ukrainian brigades, made a series of despairing comments on the internet. They gave film of themselves making those comments and acknowledged as much. And as I have already said, I strongly suspect that those soldiers are amongst those who have been cut off. And, well, perhaps the most dramatic news over the last couple of hours, apart from the Russian capture of Karlovka and Galitsinivka, is that the Russians do seem now to have captured the whole of Sinkovka in the area of near Kupiansk, the village that was for a very long time seen as the gateway to Kupiansk. It's apparently now finally, after long months of inconclusive battles, anyway, it's fallen under Russian control. Apparently, the fact has been acknowledged even by some Ukrainian sources. And that, of course, brings the Russians close to Kupiansk itself. There's a forested area close to Kupiansk. Maybe the Ukrainians will try to defend themselves there. But a forested area can also serve the benefits of attackers. They can infiltrate troops using the forests as cover and approach the Ukrainian defenses in the Kupiansk area that more effectively also. So, very bad situation there as well. And this sudden Russian activity in the area of Kupiansk, as I said, it strongly suggests to me that the situation in Volchansk, of the Ukrainians in Volchansk, is deteriorating. And I saw in the group of forces north, this short section in the neighborhood of the high-rise apartment buildings in Volchansk. Intrepid assault groups are fighting hard in an apartment building. Advance is hampered by the Ukrainian use of FPV drones. Doesn't tell us very much, but it hints, or so it seems to me, that the Russians are advancing, despite the fact that in Volchansk, the Ukrainians are throwing everything they can to try to slow the Russians down. In Chasiv Yar, by the way, there were some reports yesterday that the Russians have made very, very big advances over the last 2 days, and that most of Chasiv Yar, the central part of Chasiv Yar, is now under their control. But the reports were very unsketchy and very unclear. Anyway, that's perhaps the overall situation on the battlefronts. The energy system, of course, in Ukraine has collapsed. The country's in a state of default. The army is bleeding on the front lines. The political situation in Kiev continues to appear unstable. There are reports that General Syrski is now going around telling everybody that he had no idea about the Kursk operation until the moment before it was launched, and when he was told about it, he was so shocked he was on the verge of resigning. Anyway, that's what the reports say. That's not what General Syrski himself has been telling us, but he doesn't seem to be very enthusiastic about the Kursk operation, and I get the sense that he never has been. But anyway, one way or the other, the situation is quite exceptionally bad. But note that all the talk of just a few weeks ago about Ukraine finally reconciling itself to the need for negotiations has melted away. I remember that throughout July, and indeed going back to June, going down back to Putin's speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry board when he outlined his ideas of what Ukraine would have to do in order for there to be a settlement of the crisis in Ukraine. I remember that for several weeks the Ukrainians were telling everybody that they were prepared to talk. They sent Kuleba to China, where he met Wang Yi. They invited and pressed Modi to come to Kiev, which he did. Apparently, it turns out he was only there for a few hours. If I said otherwise, in fact, I did say otherwise, I was quite wrong about that. Apparently, he was only there for just a few hours, and the meeting did not apparently go well. But anyway, the Ukrainians were giving everybody the impression that they were starting to accept reality and were prepared to engage the Russians in some kind of serious negotiation. And the fascinating thing is that since the Kursk operation, not only has all of that talk vanished from Ukrainian airwaves, but it continues to have vanished even as the situation in Kursk has gone into reverse, and even as we start to see telltale signs of a collapse in Pokrovsk and in the rest of Donbass. Despite these accumulating disasters on the battlefronts, the Ukrainians are refusing to engage the Russians in serious negotiations. Instead, all their energy is being taken up with trying to persuade the Americans and the Europeans to authorize them to launch missile strikes deep inside Russia, and to get the Western powers to send them even more weapons. They're also, by the way, demanding that the loan, the $50 billion loan that is supposed to be paid from the proceeds of frozen Russian assets and which is supposed to be guaranteed by the European Union, they're demanding that this loan should be handed over to them immediately, apparently in its entirety, in other words, not scaled over any period of time, and that it be given to them, no strings attached. An astonishing, extraordinary, grandiose demand, not at all the demand that you would expect from a country that is asking for such a thing from those countries that have put themselves at such cost to themselves, put themselves out at such cost to themselves to support Ukraine, as they would say, through this crisis. And when the Ukrainians now talk about peace, they once again have reverted to Zelensky's formula. The point was made very forcefully by the Russian deputy ambassador to the United Nations, Dmitry Polyansky, in an interview he gave to Glenn Deason and myself, which you can find on the Duran. Whenever anybody tries to get the Ukrainians to talk, to sit down, to negotiate, they often say that they are prepared to negotiate. Then they pull off something like the Kursk operation. They demand more weapons, and then they come back, and it is clear that they have not shifted from their original demand, which is the demand set out in Zelensky's so-called peace plan, which, as I've said many times, is a plan for Russia's total capitulation, which is a bizarre idea at this stage in the war. And I've come to the conclusion that the Ukrainians are never going to shift from that position. Zelensky himself almost certainly is unable to do that. It's possible, though far from certain, that following the disasters in Donbass and the criticism of this Kursk operation, we will finally see moves to oust him from his position as president of Ukraine. Maybe the opposition within Ukraine, Poroshenko, Zaluzhny, Klitschko and all of those people will finally get their act together and will move against him and will push him out. Or maybe the Americans will finally say enough's enough. This person is obviously incapable either of conducting the war effectively or of agreeing to some kind of face-saving settlement from the Russians. But to be honest, I'm starting to even have doubts about this. Despite everything, Zelensky stays there, stays where he is. Every disaster, every misfortune, nonetheless, even as it happens, even as the criticism of Zelensky mounts, he remains in place despite his failures as a war leader or as a leader of a country at war becoming ever more obvious. And again, I think that the political will to oust him probably is not there either. The Americans worry that if they take such a step, there could be an uncontrolled collapse, and they don't want to see that. And I suspect that by now, the very hardline figures, Poroshenko and Zaluzhny and the various elements of the Azov Brigade, and all of those who have at various times muttered about the need to get rid of Zelensky, almost certainly they understand that it's too late now, that the writing is on the wall. I suspect that keeping Zelensky in place actually serves their purposes now, because it means that when Ukraine goes down, they have a scapegoat to blame, who is, of course, Zelensky. They can say that he and the West betrayed their great project, and in the meantime, all of these people can continue with their myth and narrative construction about the heroic defense that Ukraine put up in the face of the war. This is not unprecedented. In the Second World War, of course, Germany only surrendered after its leader committed suicide. And of course, by that point, most of the country had been occupied by the Allied powers. Perhaps an even better example, an even closer example, is what happened in the American Civil War, which I know some Americans describe as the war between the states. It's often overlooked that the South never formally surrendered. Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the South, never surrendered. No political body representing the South surrendered on behalf of the South. Various military units, as I've discussed in previous programs, eventually did surrender, but there was no overall political surrender by the South. And I'm starting to think that that is the way we are going to go. In which case, this conflict perhaps still has some way to go. I get the sense that the Russians themselves have lost such interest in negotiations as they might once have had. Again, if we go back to that interview with Polyansky that Glenn Deason and I did, he spoke, I felt, with some measure of relief that the pressure from Russia's friends to seek a negotiated solution to the war had eased after Ukraine began its Kursk operation. And people like Medvedev in Russia have made it absolutely clear that negotiation on anything else than terms for unconditional surrender is something that they are not interested in. Putin has not gone quite that far, but I suspect that he's starting to veer in that direction also. So, we're probably going to see many months of war still. I suspect that over the next couple of months, after Pokrovsk falls, the Russians will clear up Donbass. I can't see how the Ukrainians will be able to defend places like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk for very long. To be clear, once Donbass falls in its entirety, any remaining territories that Ukraine still controls in Zaporozhye are going to be lost as well, including the city of that name. And I suspect that before long, we're also going to see the Ukrainians pushed out of Kharkiv and Sumy region as well. Because again, I don't really see how these places are defendable. If the Russians are already on the Dnieper, and if Donbass, the entirety of Donbass, is under Russian control. And then the Russians will have the decision. Do they cross the Dnieper? Do they advance on Kiev? Do they occupy all the territory west of the Dnieper? Do they advance on Odessa itself? I've always felt that in some form or in some way, the Russians will want to re-establish some kind of control or at least presence in Odessa. What will the Russians do? It could very well be, and I've only very recently come to this view, that this will only end once every millimeter of Ukrainian territory, including Western Ukraine, has come entirely under Russian control. I say that because a desire for negotiation in Kiev, an ability to conduct negotiation, does not appear to exist. And whilst I think it does exist on the part of some people in the West, as we saw during the Vietnam War, the West can come to agreements with the other side, But if their protege, South Vietnam in that case, is not prepared to abide by those agreements, then the ultimate collapse becomes inevitable. Well, anyway, we shall see what the future holds. But in terms of the battlefield, I don't think anyone any longer looking at the situation can pretend to themselves with any degree of honesty anymore that Ukraine can win. Anyway, that's where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And also, please don't forget that you can check out our shop where you will find all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, all that. And remember also, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.